Hello, my American history students. This is your second video of the week. I hope you enjoyed our previous lesson on rules in government. A lot of these topics are going to align with some of the topics on Khan Academy. So if you are doing the online curriculum, a lot of this should be familiar to you. And even from class, we covered a lot of these topics before. So you should be comfortable with the vocabulary and some of the background information. So this week, what are we going to talk about? Well, we are going to talk about today the War of 1812, specifically the Battle for New Orleans, and we're going to talk a little bit about Dolly Madison and what she did to save the White House. I'm sure some of you remember this. We talked about it a couple weeks before we left for break, but before I start, see if you can remember the story. It's an interesting one. But first, let's get right into it. So we're going to start with the War of 1812, okay? So remember, after the Louisiana Purchase, Americans from the East began flocking to the West. We spent a lot of time, you guys studied all the westward movements of the Indian tribes. We studied the Louisiana Purchase from France, so you should know about Napoleon and how he sold that area to us for pennies on the dime. And it was the biggest steal of the century because it expanded the United States by a whole third, okay? So we have all this land west of the Mississippi River ready to colonize. And at this point, we are basically kicking the Indians off their land, okay? So at this point, leading up to the War of 1812, we are not on friendly terms with the Indians at all, okay? But also about this time, the United States and Great Britain began to disagree over how shipping and trade were handled in Europe. Remember, we were getting most of our supplies and a lot of our everyday items from Great Britain. England and France were still at war, and France controlled most of Europe at this time. English ships held control over most of the oceans. American ships trading in the area were neutral. They were not involved in the war and didn't support either side, France or Britain. Americans traded with both sides, but this upset the British because they felt that Americans should side with them since they were their mother country before they broke away. So let's talk about blockades and impressment. You guys should be very familiar with those two words. We've talked about them before, okay? So to show its power, England set up a blockade of the European coast. A blockade is the closing of an area to stop people or goods from entering or leaving a certain place. Later, the French set up a blockade of the British Isles. American ships couldn't trade in either side without risking being captured by the British or the French, and that's why they wanted to stay neutral. Then the British started doing something called impressment. Impressment means forcing people to serve in the military. If a British and American ship met, sailors from the British ship would take any British sailors from the American ship as prisoners. Many of the captured sailors had left other British ships to make more money working on American ships. The captured British sailors were then forced to serve in the British military. American sailors were also captured and forced to work for the British fleets. The US did not like this treatment of American sailors at all. So coming from our side, it was unfair. So we didn't want to take sides in this at all, but we were kind of forced to if Britain was going to capture our American citizens. The US declares war. All right, here we go, on to the good stuff. By 1807, President Thomas Jefferson, third president, saw that tempers were rising. In order to prevent war, he convinced Congress to pass an embargo against all foreign countries. That's another buzzword, embargo. You should know what that means as well. An embargo makes it illegal to trade with certain nations. The US chose not to buy goods or to sell goods to any foreign nations. So it was really important to us to maintain that neutrality at this time. This embargo was supposed to punish Great Britain for its behavior toward America. However, the British had most of the goods they needed already. So the embargo against Great Britain hurt America much more in the long run than it hurt them because we weren't able to buy anything we needed from them, okay? There was another cause, though, for disagreement between the Americans and the British. In the Northwest Territory, many American Indians were frustrated that so many settlers were taking their land. Because of this, they joined with the British to fight against the Americans whenever they could, because they both wanted the same thing. And the British promised the American Indians that if they fought on their side, the British, if they won, would give them their land back. So that was a huge incentive for the American Indians to fight on the British side. Eventually, a group of US congressmen called war hawks, war hawks mean men who wanted to go to war against Great Britain. That's what they were called. So pro-war people. They convinced President James Madison to declare war on Great Britain. The US declared war on June 18, 1812. America was hoping to gain control of the oceans, stop the British and American Indian attacks against settlers in the Northwest, and drive the British out of North America. So remember, they wanted to stop the Indians attacking Americans moving west because we opened all that land. So the British were kind of helping the Indians fight against us, okay? So they were instigating that conflict. All right. So the war ended basically without accomplishing any of its original goals. The Treaty of Ghent didn't deal with the issue of the blockades, impressment, or American Indian problems. It simply ended the war and restored peace. After the war, the British quit supporting the American Indians in their fight against the settlers. Without the support of the British, the American Indians were forced to sign treaties with the US government. The US moved the American Indians off their land and opened up the area for future American settlements. So the main benefit of the War of 1812 for the United States side was the feeling of confidence it created in the American people, that we could stand up for ourselves and that we could fight a war and win. The ability to win another war against the British gave Americans a stronger belief in the leadership and the military power of the new country. It also increased their confidence that America had the ability to succeed over other nations. So remember, America was just a baby at this point. We're a new nation. So we needed that confidence, okay, to move forward and know that we'll be okay. We can do this on our own. We don't need Great Britain to hold our hand anymore. All right. So next I want to talk a little bit about the Battle for New Orleans, okay? So I don't know if you remember this story a little bit, but I'm going to just go in a little deeper into the details. But okay, so after the Treaty of Ghent was signed in Belgium and the war was officially over with the signing of the treaty, but news didn't travel as fast as it does now, okay? 3 weeks after the treaty was signed, neither American nor British soldiers had received word of the treaty. Britain had sent troops to New Orleans to try to end the war with a great victory. More than 50 ships sailed into the Gulf of Mexico heading towards New Orleans. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson was on his way to defend the city. When he arrived, he found that the British were very close. Jackson did not have a large army to use. What could he do? He declared martial law, which means that every weapon and every able-bodied man in the city was required to come defend it. Jackson ended up with an army of over 4,000 men. His army must have looked really strange to the British, for it had all sorts of men. There were some aristocrats, freed slaves, Choctaw American Indians, enslaved men, and even a pirate named John Lafitte. Militiamen came from Louisiana and the nearby states of Kentucky and Tennessee. So this is in direct comparison, or I'm sorry, in contrast to the British Army, who are all officers, they're very well groomed, they have crisp uniforms, they've trained their whole life to be soldiers, and Andrew Jackson is basically forcing conscription on any free man he can get his hands on. Here, have a gun, go fight for our side, okay? We needed the numbers. All right. The hastily thrown together group had to fight a well-trained British army of around 8,000, so almost double the amount. Just like in the Revolutionary War, it looked like Americans were outgunned and outtrained. This time, the Americans had Andrew Jackson, though. He directed some of the enslaved people to dig a mile-long defensive trench. They used the dirt from the trench to build a protective wall called the rampart. The fighting began on January 8, 1815. The British commander, Edward Panikin, was killed quickly, and things did not improve for the British. After 2 hours of fighting, over 2,000 British soldiers killed, compared to only 65 Americans. Think about that for a second. That's a huge victory, considering we have half the amount of soldiers they had. The British retreated and fighting stopped. The Americans were victorious. The Americans won, but it didn't change the outcome of the War of 1812. The Americans had already ended the war weeks before the Treaty of Ghent. So think about that. All the lives that could have been saved because they didn't know that the war had officially ended. So that battle was, even though it happened, it was kind of meaningless in the end. The Battle of New Orleans made Andrew Jackson a famous hero, though, and made Americans feel national pride. This would help Jackson become president years later in 1828. All right, so Dolly Madison. I want you guys to think back. Do you remember what she did? Think for a second how she saved the White House. No? Anybody? All right. So, as the War of 1812 raged on, the British threatened Washington, D.C., which is the nation's capital, and the residents packed up their things and fled for safety. President Madison left to meet with his generals, but his wife, Dolly Madison, insisted on staying in the White House and waiting for him to return. It must have been very tense waiting and wondering how soon the British would arrive. Dolly Madison and her servants watched out the windows with spyglasses. Finally, her friends convinced her to leave. Excuse me. The First Lady, however, would not leave without the portrait of George Washington. She did not want the British soldiers to find it and ruin it. Mrs. Madison asked 15-year-old Paul Jennings, an enslaved African American, for help. Paul tried to make the portrait while it was inside the frame, but time was running out, so Dolly Madison ordered him to break the frame and just save the portrait. He did, and they immediately left and escaped Washington, D.C. with it. Together, Dolly Madison and Paul Jennings saved George Washington's portrait. It's a good thing, too, for when the British arrived, they set fire to the White House. So Dolly Madison, besides being a First Lady, is also a hero. She saved this very important portrait of George Washington. It would have burned down with the White House. All right, so that's enough lecture for today. I hope you guys enjoyed the review, and hopefully you learned something new that you didn't pick up on earlier in this year. I'm going to show you the three discussion questions that I want you to write down. Okay, so get your notebook ready and a pencil or pen to write it down. All right, here we go. Remember, you're going to pause your video right here and you're going to copy it down. Hopefully the glare isn't that bad and you can read it. Okay. All right. So I look forward to hearing your answers in our next Zoom meeting. So when this video airs, it will be Thursday morning. Good Friday is being observed this year, so that means that we won't be meeting on Zoom this Friday. So I will look forward to seeing your answers to these three discussion questions Monday in our academic Zoom meeting at 9:30, okay? And you also can show me your first weekly CNN challenge filled out, okay? Remember, we'll enter your name into a drawing to win a free gift certificate for doing this weekly. But again, since we won't be on Zoom Friday, you're going to show me Monday, okay? So I look forward to seeing your answers, and we'll see you tomorrow on Zoom. Bye, guys.